Welcome to the Migraine Miracle Moment. I'm your host, Dr. Josh Turknett. I'm a neurologist, migraine specialist, migraine sufferer, and author of the book, The Migraine Miracle. In this podcast, you'll learn all about how to find your path to migraine freedom without pills. Let's get started. Howdy, folks. So we're in the final days of 2018, and I thought it'd be a good time to take a moment to reflect back on this past year with the Miracle Moment and highlight some of the most important episodes. If you're like me, one thing you struggle with in this day and age is trying to manage all the information that we now have access to. On the one hand, it's an incredible blessing that we have virtually the entire store of human knowledge at our fingertips, and on top of that, there's great new content being produced all the time. And there's far more than we can ever get to in a single lifetime, so it's easy after we consume something, whether it's a book, an article, or an episode of a podcast, to just move right on to the next thing. But if we want whatever we've just consumed to matter, if we want it to function as more than just entertainment, then we do need time to sit with it a bit. Plus, it's rare for things to sink in fully the first time around. One of the key principles of learning anything is repetition, and in particular, repetition that's spaced out in time is of particular use. So, in light of all that, I thought I'd take this end of the year to highlight a few key episodes of the podcast, and I'll be releasing these over the next several days as we approach 2019. These are all episodes that contain messages that I see as especially important to anyone's success in slaying the beast once and for all, which I know for many of you will be a goal for 2019. Today's episode I'm airing is the 3 keys to ditching sugar. So if you've read the book or you've spent much time at our website or in our Facebook group, then you know that getting rid of sugar, specifically added sugar, is one of the essentials to being successful with the Migraine Miracle Plan. It's a critical piece in breaking carbohydrate dependency and developing the metabolic flexibility, which is one of the 3 pillars of protection against migraine. It's been an essential piece in the success of everyone we've worked with, and it's also one of those things that's definitely harder for some than others. But for those who've done it and kicked the sugar habit, almost all are surprised by how drastically the cravings go away once you've kind of broken the habit. Many scientists compare what happens in the brain with sugar to what happens with any other addictive substances. Those changes can produce powerful cravings when the addiction is in full swing, but once you weaken those brain circuits, things get a whole lot easier. And we've heard from quite a number of people who say, if I can break the sugar habit, so can you. And many folks have used the strategies that I cover in this episode to break that addiction. Before we get to that episode, just a reminder that in January, we're launching our first Breaking Rebound Challenge. So we hold regular 30-day challenges inside of Migraine Neverland for our members, and we do these about once a month. And the first one we're doing in January is the Breaking Rebound Challenge. As you'll hear in so many of our success stories, breaking rebound, or the vulnerability to future migraines that are caused by the abortive medications, is an absolutely critical step in getting to migraine freedom, and it's no coincidence that this is the very first step that so many of our most successful members have taken. As I talked about a couple of episodes ago where I discussed the concept of the future migraine risk score, which is a reflection of the amount by which each dose of medication we take predisposes us to a future migraine, there's very little in the way of help for folks who are trying to break out of rebound and move to a drug-free path to migraine freedom. And one way to provide that help is simply to give folks a community of people who are going through the same thing. While there are a lot of online migraine communities out there, many of them are unfortunately centered around drug solutions. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably looking for a solution without drugs because you're concerned about the long-term risks and because you know that the drugs ultimately undermine your ability to achieve lasting freedom from migraines for the reasons we've discussed before. So during this challenge, you'll have a community of people who have the same goals as you, and we'll provide all the resources, tips, and strategies that we've accumulated over the past several years in helping so many folks through this. So if that sounds of interest to you, we'd love to have you as part of the challenge, and to learn more about Migraine Neverland and all the resources that we offer, just go to mymigrainemiracle.com and click on the Resources tab at the top. Also, I've created a page that lists out the challenges for the next year, and you can find that by going to mymigrainemiracle.com/schedule. And lastly, I wanted to share a recent quote from someone who just finished the Beast Slayer Training Academy. For those of you who don't know, the Academy is one of the features of Migraine Neverland. As I've said before, the book, The Migraine Miracle, is where you learn the why behind the Migraine Miracle Plan and gain the essential knowledge that you need. And then Migraine Neverland and the resources that come with it, including the Beast Slayer Training Academy, are where you'll learn to put it all are where you'll learn how to put it all into action and have a family of supporters behind you. So at the end of the academy, as people are finishing it up, there's a survey to fill out about the course, and this quote comes from Julia from a few days ago, where she says, "I learned so many things from your course and am immensely grateful that you have put it out there. I am 50 years old and have had migraine since I was 5 years old. I thought Relpax was a godsend after having tried Imitrex, Zomig, and Maxalt, and Topamax, Prozac, amitriptyline, SPG blocks, Cephaly, and Botox. I took Relpax for maybe the past 14 years, but I was getting more and more migraines, up to 20 a month, and recently wondered if the Relpax might be causing rebound headaches. I have wonderful doctors, including a terrific neurologist at the UC San Francisco Headache Center, and nobody ever informed me about the risk of rebound headaches. Although perhaps there is some tiny font language in the patient package insert I read so many years ago with my first prescription, I never knew I was making things worse by taking this medication. Your book should be picked up by a big publisher and marketed internationally, and you should be on national television. I only found you out of desperation, and it should be easier to find you than that. Thank you so much." So thanks, Julia. That was a fantastic. So thanks so much, Julia, for sharing that with us. I totally agree that this information should be much easier to find. Unfortunately, there are some pretty big pockets that don't want this information easily found, and that's of course part of the problem. But slowly but surely that's changing, so keep sharing your story with anyone who will listen, and I think things will change for the better. Okay, with that dose of inspiration, let's get to the episode, 3 Keys to Ditching Sugar. Most of you probably know that getting sugar and refined carbohydrates, of which sugar is one, out of your diet is an essential piece of the Migraine Miracle Plan. If that's news to you, then I'd recommend that you grab the diet guide I just mentioned over at beastslayers.com, and then head over to the Migraine Miracle Moment homepage, which is at mymigraine.miracle.com/moment, and listen, read, or watch some of the early episodes. But just to summarize, if you recall, the 3 pillars to migraine freedom are eliminating rebound, establishing metabolic fat flexibility or fat adaptation, and eliminating mismatched foods and behaviors. And ditching sugar and refined carbohydrates is an essential element of 2 of those pillars, which are establishing metabolic flexibility and eliminating mismatched foods, as our consumption of sugar is one of the biggest ways in which our modern lives deviate from that of our ancestors, creating a significant mismatch, and it's the consumption of sugar that renders so many people metabolically inflexible or incapable of tapping into stored body fat for energy, which leaves everyone riding the blood sugar roller coaster every day, which is a huge setup for migraines. So nobody would argue that eating sugar isn't rewarding or pleasurable, and that's thanks to how our brain is wired. So by default, our brain naturally perceives sugar as pleasurable. The problem is that the reward circuitry for sugar evolved during a time when sugar was very scarce. So it made sense for us to consume it, whatever we could of it, whenever we could. But now, in our modern world, where sugar is abundant and very easy to get, those reward circuits are no longer working to our benefit. So they're leading so many people to consume far too much of it. Again, this is a perfect example of an environmental mismatch. So where our reward circuits exist to reinforce behaviors that are good for us, and those reward circuits for sugar, which make us feel pleasure when we eat it, were beneficial to us in the world of our wild ancestors where sugar was hard to come by. But those exact same circuits are now incredibly harmful because while consuming a little bit of sugar once in a great while isn't an issue, consuming a lot of it frequently is a huge problem. So our reward circuits are having the opposite effect on our health because they are mismatched to the environment we now find ourselves in. And as I've said before, most of the diseases that we see as physicians nowadays, migraines included, occur as a direct consequence of these kind of environmental mismatches. So recognizing them and eliminating them is a cornerstone, not just to migraine prevention, but to general health and wellness overall. And for many people, those pleasure pathways that are triggered by sugar have been reinforced and strengthened over a lifetime, usually beginning in childhood, and so they've become incredibly powerful. But the good news is it's entirely possible to weaken those pathways, and it really doesn't take all that long for that to happen, especially if we use some key strategies that have an excellent track record when it comes to changing our behavior. I know with the holidays behind us and a new year in front of us that many of you have resolved that this is the year to commit fully to starting a new chapter when it comes to your health and your migraines. And maybe you've been contemplating making the change for a while now, but we're looking for the right time to start. Or perhaps you're recommitting yourself to it after having tried and fallen off. I know that's an issue for some folks, and one of the biggest reasons that people struggle, either with getting started or staying with it once they do, has to do with giving up sugar. It's also clearly one of those things that exists along a spectrum. While giving it up may come fairly easy to some, for others it's much harder and can end up being their Achilles heel. So, as we'll talk about in this episode, those differences, where you fit on that spectrum, has a lot to do with whether your thoughts about sugar or the story of sugar and sweets that you tell yourself are working for you or against you as you try to ditch it from your diet. And so that's why the first two of our three strategies relate to mindset or our attitudes regarding sugar. Another way of thinking of mindset is as the stories we tell ourselves about the things in our lives. And those stories we tell are incredibly powerful, profoundly impacting how we behave, oftentimes in ways we're not even aware of. And the wonderful thing about this is that once you recognize how powerful these stories are, and the fact that you are the one deciding what story to tell, it opens up so much possibility in the realm of personal and behavioral transformation. You may have heard me say before that mindset is the single biggest predictor of success with the Migraine Miracle Plan, as mindset can either be your greatest ally or your greatest enemy. You ultimately decide the stories you tell, and so you get to choose if you tell yourself a story that works to your advantage or disadvantage. So the first strategy is to change the story you're telling about yourself, or more specifically, about your relationship to sugar and sweets. So the story that many who struggle with breaking the sugar habit goes something like this. I'm someone who struggles constantly with sugar cravings and must always use my willpower to fight against them. Sugar and sweets have power over me. I've tried before to break the habit and failed, and that's probably how it will continue to be. So in this case, even if you resolve to break the habit, if this is the story you continue to carry around, then that story will almost certainly continue to prove true. In other words, the very fact that you're telling this story is playing a big role in that story coming true. On the other hand, if you resolve to break the habit and today change your story to, I'm someone who avoids sugar and sweets. I've struggled unsuccessfully in the past to break the habit, but now I'm finally conquering it. You'll have drastically improved your odds of being successful, and just by something as simple as changing your story. Now, you may think, but that's exactly what's happened in my life. Sugar has had a powerful impact on me, and I have struggled mightily to break the habit. So telling myself anything else wouldn't be true. But the mistake in that line of thinking is to think of these stories as one-directional. In other words, to view these stories that we tell ourselves, or your story of sugar in this case, as simply a set of observations about your life. When the reality is, and there's decades of psychological research to support this, the story you tell directly influences what happens to you. So the incredible thing about mindset is that over time, you become the stories you tell about yourself. And so changing your stories is one of the simplest and most powerful ways you can change your life for the better. Furthermore, if you struggled over and over and over at something and haven't succeeded, almost certainly it has little to do with your ability to succeed and a whole lot more to do with the story you're telling yourself about that thing. So that's the first strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, the second strategy is also a mindset strategy. And that's to change the story you're telling about sugar itself. Another thing that gets in the way of people breaking the sugar habit is the story people tell themselves about sugar. So one common story that people might have, the one that makes kicking the habit really hard, is what I'd call the story of deprivation. And it goes something like this. Those people who get to enjoy eating sweets and sugar are so lucky, and it's so unfair that I have to avoid them because of my migraines. I'm so unlucky to have migraines. Everyone else gets to enjoy sweets, but I have to deprive myself. So it's not hard to see why this kind of story would be counterproductive and why it would make ditching sugar really hard. And again, we get to choose the stories we tell, and there's no reason we must choose this one. In fact, there's another story of sugar, one that I'd argue is a lot closer to the truth anyways, that makes ditching the habit a lot easier, especially compared to the story of deprivation that I just described. So for this new story about sugar, I'm going to give an analogy. Imagine that running full speed off of a cliff was the most exhilarating and pleasurable experience you could ever imagine. So much so that most people's brains were wired so that just starting to run towards a cliff felt really good. And because of this, people were dying left and right because everyone was jumping off a cliff because there was nothing in their brain signaling that it was dangerous or that it shouldn't be done. Now imagine there's a small group of people who, instead of feeling pleasure when they run towards the edge of a cliff, feel an intense pain in their head and so have no temptation whatsoever to jump off. Now, if you were one of those people, it would make no sense to bemoan the fact that you don't get to jump off, that those other people who do are the lucky ones because they don't feel any pain. But this is just a more extreme example of the situation with sugar. There are all sorts of pleasurable things out there that we don't do because we know in the long run they'll be harmful. Things like, drugs of abuse and gambling and all manner of dangerous behaviors that may feel great in the moment or in the short term, but that we know are ultimately destructive. And for the most part, you probably don't have any trouble avoiding doing those things. And that's precisely because of the story you're telling yourself about those things. And the same goes for anything else you're trying to avoid, including sugar. If I were to tell you that your next bite of brownie would lead to your death or the death of your loved one, I'd bet a good money that you'd kick the habit for good without any trouble. And again, in this case, it would have nothing would have changed but the story that you're telling yourself about sugar. Because implicit in this notion that you're being deprived and that the people who get to enjoy sugar without migraines are lucky is that they're getting something good. If you truly thought they were being harmed by it, as in these other examples, that wouldn't be the case. So another story you could tell yourself to replace the story of deprivation is that you're fortunate in that you have an early detection system. So for most people, sugar ends up being a silent killer, promoting disease in multiple organs without symptoms for many years until it's many times too late to do anything about it. And of course, that's a very different way of viewing things than the story of deprivation. But once again, you get to choose which story to tell yourself. If you choose the old one, the story of deprivation, that the story that sugar really isn't so bad, you'll make it much harder on yourself and make the journey one of unpleasantness and struggle. If you decide on the other story, you'll make it much easier on yourself and make the journey one of appreciation, gratitude, and ease. So those are the first two key strategies, again, involving changing mindset or the story that you're telling yourself. And the third key strategy is to change your environment. So when it comes to changing our behavior, if we want to stop doing one thing in favor of another, we essentially have two ways we can go about it. First, we can use the sheer force of our will to make the change. So in the case of sugar and sweets, we can say, I'm just going to exercise better self-control from now on. When those donuts are sitting in the break room table, or when I pass by the cookies in the pantry, I'm just going to resolve from this day forward to resist temptation. The other way we can go about it is to change our environment. And to change our environment in ways that make the decisions that we want to make easy and the choices that we don't want to make hard. So let me give you an example. Imagine if you made it your New Year's resolution to go to the gym and do 40 flights of stairs on the Stairmaster every day. Now, that'd be a great goal and would be wonderful for your health. Now, doing this is going to require that you completely change your daily routine. So you have to figure out a way to carve out that hour or two that you need to travel back and forth to the gym and do your exercises. So maybe you decide you're going to wake up 2 hours early, or you try to do it at night after work. Needless to say, achieving this goal is going to take a significant amount of effort and willpower. And I'm sure everyone is aware of how dismal the statistics are in people following through on these sorts of resolutions. Every gym knows they're going to see a surge in memberships come January, and by February, almost all of those people aren't going to be around anymore. So very few people would be able to meet the goal that I just described using the force of will approach. Now imagine another scenario where you move into an apartment that's on the 40th floor of the apartment building, and the building has no elevator. And let's say you have no choice but to live here. Now, do you think you'd make your 40 flights of stairs a day goal? Of course you would. So not only would it require zero willpower because you have no choice in the matter, you'd do it automatically. It would be built into the daily routine of your life. And I bring up this example just to demonstrate how significantly our environment can shape our behavior, and that when we're trying to make some type of major change, it's far more effective for us to set up our environment in ways that promote our desired behavior than it is for us to use our force of will to accomplish it. The key to this strategy is simply to make the behavior you're trying to stop, in this case eating sugar or sweets, harder, and make the behavior you're trying to replace it with, where applicable, easier. So if you're trying to give up sweets and sugar, think about the scenarios where you give in and ask, what can I do to keep myself out of that situation, and then design your environment or your lifestyle accordingly. Obviously, if you don't have sugar and sweets available, if you have no access to it, it'll be that much harder to eat them. Furthermore, the more you can integrate the good decisions, the behaviors you do want, into the routine of your life and make it as inevitable as possible, obviously the easier it will be to do those things. All right, so those are 3 really powerful strategies anyone can use to ditch the sugar habit. So to review, the first strategy is to change the story you tell about your relationship to sugar, from a story that goes something like, giving up sugar has and always will be really hard for me, to, I may have struggled with it in the past, but it's no longer who I am. The second is to change your story of sugar from one of deprivation, like, I'm so unlucky that I can't have sugar because I have migraines and can't enjoy it like everyone else, to, excess sugar is incredibly damaging to health, and I'm fortunate that I have an early detection system that protects my long-term health. And then the third strategy is to change your environment, to make consuming nutrient-dense whole foods easy and eating sugar and sweets really hard. Okay, so that's it for this best of episode from 2018. Once again, if you want to make 2019 the year you commit to slaying the beast for good, we'd love to have you as part of Migraine Neverland. Just head over to mymigrainemiracle.com and click on the resources tab at the top to learn more and to get signed up. And I will be back tomorrow with another best of 2018 episode. First is that none of these modules or functionally specific networks exist in isolation. Even though a software program is a self-contained piece of code, it still requires computer hardware to run on, and a user to provide inputs, and so on. And the same is true of our brain networks. None of them exist in isolation. They are constantly receiving inputs from and are modified by other parts of the brain. And so it would be misleading to say that any given task is performed entirely by an isolated network, just as it would be misleading to ignore the role of the computer hardware and the user in the output of a piece of software. And the second important thing to remember is that while certain functionally specific modules tend to cluster in certain areas of the brain, there are often elements of a functional network that are distributed in different areas of the brain. So a single functional network may be anatomically distributed across various parts of the brain, especially if that network assimilates disparate kinds of sensory information. Case in point is the organization of circuits for analyzing the information contained in speech. There's a circuit on one side of the brain for decoding the meaning of words, and other circuits on the other side of the brain for detecting the modifications of meaning that come from the tone or frequency spectrum of those words. So, if we broadly consider the brain networks for analyzing speech, we find that anatomically they are broadly distributed throughout the brain, even though they're functionally segregated. One of the more headline-grabbing findings in recent years was the discovery of the Jennifer Aniston neuron, a single neuron that would only fire in the presence of Jennifer Aniston's face. The paper that published it also showed this to be the case for any face that a subject was familiar with. At first glance, this would seem to suggest the most extreme version of the localizationist model. However, that particular neuron's activation is still dependent on the activity of networks involved in the acquisition and filtering of visual information. Furthermore, there are certain circuits that are likely relevant and involved in all cognitive functions. For example, it's necessary to be awake to perform a cognitive task, so we're going to find activity in those wakefulness networks in every cognitive function that we analyze. And there is evidence that there are other circuits that are involved anytime we engage in a challenging task. So, in this respect, these sorts of circuits are generalists and don't restrict their efforts to specific tasks. And so the answer to the fundamental question of whether the brain is a generalist or a specialist is that it's neither one or the other. There are elements of both, and there isn't any reason it must be one or the other. And by framing it in this way, we've created a false dichotomy and a false debate, a debate that vanishes once we clarify our terms a little bit. The brain is clearly segregated into functionally specific networks, a principle that is not only central to the day-to-day work of neurologists, but one that is also critical for understanding the nature of human intelligence and, as I will argue in future episodes, critical to understanding the hidden potentials inside every brain. And yet there are also ways in which the brain's organizational structure is distributed, as discussed. And it appears that the recent debates on this issue have arisen largely from the conflation of anatomical segregation and functional segregation. In other words, while a circuit involved in a particular task may tend to cluster in a certain area, other parts may be found elsewhere. In this case, the circuit is still functionally segregated, but it's anatomically distributed, even though it may still exhibit anatomical clustering. Much in the same way that the shipping department of Amazon is a functionally distinct unit within the company, but its operation is meaningless outside of the context of the rest of the company. And there are multiple shipping warehouse locations that are part of this functional network. So while there is still plenty of details left to be worked out, our fundamental question has been answered. Is brain activity distributed or modular? No, that's the wrong question. It's both. Alright, so that's it for this episode of the podcast. As always, you can find show notes, links, and transcripts from this episode, including a link to the infamous dead salmon study that I mentioned earlier by going to elitecognition.com/podcast. And if you like this podcast and you want to help others find it, it'd be awesome if you left a rating or review in iTunes. It really does help. So I will talk to you again in the new year.